Hello,
Hey,
I'm Alex,
and I'm Val.
and we're here to talk about a pretty epic episode of Sopranos. Whoever did this.
Whoever did this.
Who did do this?
So we do a Sopranos podcast.
We do.
It involves us watching The Sopranos, which we would be doing anyways.
Mm-hmm.
It involves us taking some notes, which we probably wouldn't be doing anyways.
Right. Normally it'd be mental noting.
Yes, but then we go and we immediately record this podcast. And so these are a lot of this is our
Manyth
time watching this show. So we've obviously developed these ideas over some time, but we're really just discussing kind of the things that we're seeing in the moment. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's what we do here.
that's what we do.
And today we're going to talk about whoever did this.
Mm-hmm. Which is a pretty major episode of the show.
Really major. I think I always try to reflect back on previous viewings and things like that, or at least like how I remember episodes if it's been a while since I've watched it. And I feel like I forgot that all of this was in this episode.
There's a lot that happens.
There's a lot.
So what do you forget that happens?
I think I kind of forgot that it's all one episode, like because the two halves of this episode are really different.
They're pretty distinct.
And so I feel like I just didn't think that happened and Ralphie died all in one episode.
Yeah.
I feel like, I don't know.
I feel like it's interesting, actually, in Sopranos, in a lot of the episodes where major events happen, if you actually go and revisit them, you find that a lot of seemingly unimportant things happen in those episodes.
Yeah.
I always think about the series finale, how we talk about AJ in the army for a bunch of it. And if you remember, like, the iconic moments of the final episode, you never think of that.
Right.
But there are these small plot points that are kind of happening and occur within the larger framework and kind of get overshadowed by these major events that happen, like Ralphie dying.
What would be an example of one of those in this episode for you?
Corrado with his falling down the stairs.
Oh, see, for me, that's like, I was like, I didn't realize that happened in this episode.
No, exactly. And that's a good example. Like, I would not have remembered that.
Okay, I get what you're saying.
When I think of whoever did this, I think about the storyline with Ralphie. I do not think about the storyline with Junior. And yet...
But I remember that storyline really clearly from this season. You know what I mean? I just don't think I would put it...
Yeah.
Anyways, now I know.
That's good.
It's all in this episode. So I like how this episode starts, and I don't know how we want to talk about it, but I just like, because I think like some of the main themes that are coming out for me in this watching of this episode is really about, linked in with the title. And I know it's like pretty basic, but this whole concept of whoever did this and kind of like insincerity or lying or kind of ambiguity,
or also like the manipulation of ambiguity. Because I feel like ambiguity is such a central part of Sopranos, but then I feel like different characters like Tony or Corrado are using it to their advantage.
Yeah.
Other characters' lack of awareness of the truth of a situation.
Yeah.
And then they're kind of weaponizing it or manipulating it, or they're using the possibility of Junior's dementia to be beneficial for them in this situation. And I think there's other examples too.
Yeah, no, but I just like, what I was going to say was I just really like how the episode starts with the judge saying this concludes the presentation of evidence. And like so for jurors, like not to discuss it with anyone else. Yeah. It starts off with this kind of like court procedural kind of thing, right? And so if we think about this episode in its entirety and like in the different storylines about building this evidence, then we can see that happen a lot, right? So we can see it happening with Corrado, right? Like he has these assessments being done to collect evidence to support if he's mentally incompetent or not, right? We have the FBI who are gathering evidence, like watching him in this too, sitting outside. So that's like kind of that evidence. But then we have it with these other situations. I also think in past viewings, like I made myself more certain of the things that are really ambiguous in this episode, which is really funny.
That's a human thing to do, and they're playing on us.
And maybe we can talk about how our first responses might have been later. But anyways, the other one is like, if Ralphie killed Pyomai.
Yeah.
Right? which we don't get clarity on. But Tony kind of gathers this evidence, right, as he goes about, going to the stables and things like that. And based on his interpretation of Ralphie, he builds this case of evidence. We have Polly building evidence against Ralphie for the phone call. And that's where we have the line being used, whoever did this.
That's the first time we hear
it. And so we know that it's Ralphie. Those guys don't. Yeah. Polly's really sure. And then we have Tony, who, like, it's the whoever did, so it's not Tony, whoever did this in terms of who killed Ralph. Right. So Tony, I don't think I really caught that one. Just,
Yeah, Tony says the guy was a piece of shit, whoever did this. Interestingly, it was also Tony about the phone call. He says, that was a terrible thing, whoever did it.
Yeah.
For me, there's like a darkening of Tony Soprano's character as we kind of have this redemption of Ralph Cifaretto. It's interesting and the other thing that's interesting for me about where we start the episode and where we end is that there's a lot of humor at the beginning and we end in a very dark place.
Really
so
dark.
The arc of this episode is different than many others in that they kind of play with us. You talk about this procedural element, also this comedic element, and then we kind of move forward, and by the end we're just in a place that we haven't seen in a long time. There hasn't been violence like this in this season, and so
we've never seen like them hack up a body. We've never seen them like
well, we have seen some hacking up of bodies, but not, I mean, to see Tony and Christopher so involved in it is, and also with a character that we know this well, is different.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, Ralph has been around now. This is his second season.
Right.
And typically the antagonists in this show kind of last one season and then, are kind of gone. But they kind of blended over the lines and boundaries of those two seasons. So.
Yeah. But so I think like these... all these kind of ways in which people are manipulating the evidence to like kind of prove their case. I think that kind of goes back to that first line that I was thinking.
Even in that very first scene, the lawyers, like as they finish I don't know, my legal terminology is weak, but the lawyer is saying, we want to bring something to your attention to hold against one of the jurors for being out of order.
Right.
And so there is something where they're kind of manipulating the evidence that exists as well. Like they're trying to get out of how they're seeing things. Also, it's interesting because right away they establish in this episode that they're moving past the stage of evidence, like you said.
Yeah.
And we are in this kind of Never Never Land in this episode, beyond evidence, beyond facts, because it's all kind of conjecture.
Yeah.
And so what we have with Tony is he will be weaving a story and a narrative about what happened to Ralph. He says to Christopher, you're the only one who saw it. Obviously, we've seen it too, but there's a lot that's happening to create stories and to create evidence and to fabricate a story about how things actually happened that are not evidence-based or true. So it's interesting. And that is kind of the commonality between the different storylines in this episode.
Yeah, no. The other thing is like kind of like who believes what story is interesting, right? So... And the one who's most interesting for me is Christopher. Like, we get the sense that he doesn't quite believe Tony. Yeah. But he couldn't.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
It's pretty weak. I mean,
but you could see how, like, what's he, like, he wasn't there. He's going off of what Tony's telling him, right? So he was actually the most interesting one for me, especially because I think in past viewings, I think I just assumed that Christopher knew that Tony killed Ralphie. Like, that's how I interpret it.
Christopher is wise enough to probably know that. I mean, I feel like Tony is unraveling. I feel like he's normally more careful than this. For Christopher to walk in and see Ralph bloody on the floor, Tony weeping because something's like happened to his face and he's bleeding, and all the evidence is there. I mean, his hand is burned and he's, obviously just beaten him to death. I think that Christopher can tell. Yeah. That's my understanding.
But it is always like, and until you have the evidence, can you fully embrace it? Polly can. Yeah. Polly's the type of character who like can go without evidence and just like have a feeling, right? Yeah. I think Christopher does kind of still rely on like hard evidence. Yeah. And he's like whatever, like he keeps talking about all season, indebted to Tony and like like for telling him about the guy that maybe killed his dad, right? So I don't know, like his reaction is more complicated than I think I gave it credit for in past viewings.
And there's an interesting examination in this episode of faith and evidence. We have Ralphie kind of going to Father Phil, examining faith.
Yeah,
characters
exactly.
needing something larger than themselves to invest their beliefs in.
Yeah.
It's complicated, and we do see how different characters deal with it. Obviously, Polly is on one end of the spectrum, and it is very certain, but it's very flawed.
And then,
he actually turns out to be right, interestingly.
No, well, that's the thing that's interesting. Versus, like, Father Phil, who says these kind of, like, trite...
Well, he literally says a Rolling Stones lyric
which
from
is
Sympathy
amazing.
for the Devil, which for me cheapens him even more as a character.
He's so cheap.
That he's offering spiritual guidance, and he's actually just saying rock lyrics.
From a song. Cool, Father Phil.
Were you there when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain? Deep, dude.
Yeah, super deep. But he, like, so kind of like you said, like, in terms of, like, the evidence and faith, right? Like, he's actually guiding... I don't know. Like, the question that Ralphie went to him with was, like, was his son punished for things that Ralphie had done? And, I mean, no, he wasn't. Like, that's not, you know, but Father Phil doesn't really give him... Father Phil just keeps kind of saying these cheap things to him, right? He says, like, oh, God doesn't punish you or whatever. Like, he kind of misses the point of what I think Ralphie's really looking for and what Ralphie walks away with from that conversation.
And also, Ralph's trying to... I believe that Ralph is trying to rehabilitate himself in this episode, genuinely. To a certain degree. I don't know if it would last, but during the course of this episode... Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. But at that point, I think that he is susceptible to change and to spiritual guidance that maybe could put him in a different place and on a different path. So...
Well, he's also bathing, right? So, like, that's kind of like, you know, like washing away your sins. Father Phil asks him if he wants to confess.
There's a lot of bathing in this episode.
There is a lot of bathing. That's for sure.
Love it.
I love bathing.
It's also a lot of bathing before people die in this show.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the last rites. Like, it's very religious. It's,
Well, also, I mean, this show is so clearly linked water to the afterlife, especially at the end of season 2. The last shot we have is of the ocean. In paintings all the time, we're always seeing water. In fact, I think it's in Ralphie's house, we actually see a painting of, like, waters coming on a beach. You know, there's a lot that we see.
Well, then we have the amazing scenes where they throw his body into the water.
Yeah.
Right? It's, like, filmed from across this gulf. I don't know where that would be filmed or what part of New Jersey that is, but it's beautiful. Kind of looks like where we cross over into New Jersey from here on the George Washington. The other one, just like in terms of like that kind of insincerity, just to go back to that for 1 second, was Rosalie with Ralph, which was an interesting, like, that's kind of one of those scenes that you don't really think about. But apparently, like, when they, like, he asked her to marry her, we hear that secondhand, and that he's started this new scholarship for Jackie Jr. at Rutgers. We hear that just through Carm.
Yeah.
But we see, you know, Rosalie going to Ralph and then saying to him, like, he's going to be fine. And then immediately we have a scene where she's with Carmela and she's like, he's going to be a vegetable.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
The same way that they kind of, like, they're talking about Artie...
Right.
And his mental health issues.
Yeah.
And then they, like, smile and wave really friendly.
Which is interesting, too, because that was supposed to be something that nobody knew about. Tony was manipulating that scene earlier in this season where he said, this is what happened. This is how you're going to tell everybody.
Yeah.
And, you know, you got mugged. And that story was holding up for a while, but it turns out that everybody actually does know the facts of that, but everybody's kind of dancing around it. So whoever did that was Artie. People know that now. Also, I just realized that water painting is not in Ralphie's house. It's in Junior's hospital room. Which is interesting. Which also kind of is an interesting scene because there are these multiple scenes within this episode that play off of uncertainty very heavily.
Yeah.
And they really kind of fuck with you a little bit. Like, even for Junior, like, when Tony walks in and he was like, oh, is that guy there? And Tony's like, that guy died. And you're like, oh, shit, he has dementia.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, his son. And you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like,
so, for sure. It's so amazing.
They are kind of playing with you. But yeah, that water painting is there. But again, there's all these elements of dying and moving to the afterlife and coping. And these, like, eternal things that are always an issue in this show are playing into the multiple storylines that are in this episode. So, interesting.
No, that's a great point. There's a couple scenes or situations in this episode that remind me of past episodes, so I kind of just wanted to point those ones out. We have when when Ralphie, I'll talk about that, the start of that scene later, but we have when Ralphie first comes to Tony to give him the money in that early scene, which follows a really weird thing, but it really reminded me of the scene with Vin Makazian that Tony had right before Vin Makazian died. So like we have these situations, like Tony's not a guy who you like go to if you're an emotional man to like talk about your issues, right? Like that's like just not Tony. And we see how uncomfortable he is comforting people, right? We see it in the Vin Makazian one back in season 1, and we see it here now. He's just really uncomfortable. He's much more comfortable like petting Pyomai on the face and like loving on an animal than he is with someone who's actually in pain and actually like suffering. But both of them, both Vin and Ralphie, like talk about their childhoods. Like there is this kind of reflection back on what made them the way that they are. I feel
like you're like a Vin Makazian specialist.
Like I said, he's like really one of my favorite characters.
He's a great character, but yeah, I feel like that's like your sweet spot.
Thanks. Thanks for saying that. But I don't know. Anyway, for me, there was just a lot of overlap between that, and I don't know what.
What about the showering?
Well, I'm going to talk about that after. This is just one scene that I'm talking about. Jeez.
I'm sorry. I just
You're rushing me.
I'm not trying to rush the Vin Makazian specialist.
Yeah, but there's something about, and it was interesting for me also because Ralphie went to like Father Phil asked him if he wanted to confess. There is kind of something about these characters who confess something to Tony right before they die. Yeah. It kind of anyways, there's something to it for me. And then also the link back to their childhood. Like it is, I don't know what like philosophically David Chase is trying to say about that, but there is something redeeming about characters when you know something about the way in which they grew up. I think and that happened with both of these characters.
Well, I think part of that is just coming from the perspective of the writers of this show, constantly redeeming characters who are flawed and come across in a negative light throughout the course of the show. And then right before they die, they kind of fix them. So it complicates our feelings towards them.
Totally.
And that ambiguity then exists in how do we even process the death of these characters.
Yeah. No, for sure.
I think that is a major part of it.
For sure. The other one that kind of reflected back for me with two different scenes was when Christopher and Tony were sitting on the couch after they had chopped up Ralphie, but they were waiting for it to be bright out, or dark out rather. And they're sitting on the couch and Chris has his shirt off. And it reminds me of the two other scenes we've seen with Jackie, well, most recently with Jackie Jr. and his friend before they go and do that bank heist or whatever they do, or the game or whatever. And then
Sean and Matt.
And then Sean and Matt prior to that. Yeah. And so there was something, it's like this leather couch. It's always on like a weird leather couch. I don't know. But there's something about that was like for those two groups of dudes sitting together on couches, it meant that something bad was going to happen for them. Mm-hmm. I think like, you know, again, no spoilers and like, you know, immediately we won't see the payoff of that, but I wonder if that kind of indicates something like by participating in this act, like that's something like that something's really changed. For like something's put Tony and Christopher on a different trajectory.
I think we're in a darker place than I can really remember for the core characters, and the way this episode ends, like with Tony looking in the mirror, reflecting on himself with his fucked up eyes and all beat up, wearing a Bada Bing shirt because he had to burn his clothing because of the evidence that it would present. Walking out into the light. There's something where I feel like we are, in the way the music comes in, I feel like we are in a new place. Like, I think we've kind of hit a new low.
I think so, too. That's what kind of like watching that scene kind of symbolized that for me in some ways, too. Yeah. Just because of what we know about the other characters who we've seen doing that.
Yeah. And that scene, too, also links us back to University in Season 3 with the picture of Tracy. That's largely, actually completely left unspoken about in this episode.
Yeah, but we see her.
We see her, and it's actually not heavy-handed in any way. You just see a picture of her, and if you actually
look closely,
weren't reflecting on the specifics of Season 3, you could even miss it. But that kind of plays in, too, because that was the first major confrontation between Tony and Ralph. and now the payoff is kind of happening. So we are kind of processing this, thinking about, well, is part of Tony's reaction to Ralph in response to Tracy?
And some of the things he says when he's beating him up, like they're like, she was an innocent creature.
Yeah.
What did she ever do to you?
Yeah.
Like those things could be applicable.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
To a lot of people. Like, I'm sure Ralph's heard a lot of different people.
And there's a lot of talk of horses in the episode University, which we talked about.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we were talking a lot about that. If you want to go listen to that episode.
Yeah, please do.
Let us know what you think. But yeah.
But it is playing in. It's so understated. It's kind of amazing, where you just see this picture and it's kind of this specter over this entire episode. In fact, even that shot of the spotlight on the Bing stage where there's nobody there and then Tony walks out, that is even for me kind of a reference to Tracy.
Yeah.
Like her absence is kind of
totally
dominating all the action that happens here, even though it's never talked about.
Yeah.
And it is supposedly about a horse.
Right. Yeah. We have some weird scenes in this episode, like the ones I was thinking of was there a lot of like the back of Tony's head.
Yeah.
We like follow the back of his head a lot,
Yeah.
or see the back of his head, or turn around the back of his head. So like the one scene that I was talking about before, like when Ralphie comes and, you know, ends up crying to Tony. The scene right before that is Tony kissing AJ, right? We have that weird like wrestling but then like loving scene. And then we come right in on the back of Tony's head and kind of turn around his face. And then we have this whole thing where Ralph is kind of confessing, but that's when then Tony ends that conversation with telling him about Valentina.
Yeah, which is pretty fucked up.
Which is really crazy, you know. But of course, we've just seen him now deal with Zellman, who's with Irina, right? So that was kind of interesting.
Right, so then even that is very interesting because Ralph comes across as a much better guy than Tony.
Yeah.
Which is complicated because Ralph has always been...
But maybe Ralph went and burnt down a stable because of it.
Maybe, that's true.
So I don't know.
So we don't really know. But it's interesting because Ralph has always been the foil to Tony that makes him look good in comparison. He is a more negative force than Tony Soprano.
Maybe Ralphie's just a really good guy.
I mean, they are kind of fucking with you here. I mean, he's not. He's definitely not that.
They tell us that a lot, though.
That he's a really good guy?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Ralphie, he's a really good guy.
They keep saying it.
I think some people are also laughing in people's faces as they say that. Also, in that scene with Tony and AJ, he offers him French toast, and there's all these orange juices in the background of the shot. So, orange juice, eggs, death, death. And then in the scene, this is like the ultimate egg, orange juice example in this season. With Ralphie, he's making an egg, and he actually says, you know, do you want eggs? And he cracks an egg, and we see more orange juice in the back. Right. And interestingly there too, there's even some color things happening, like Ralphie's wearing all white, Tony's wearing all black. So going back to this reformation of Ralphie, I feel like he's actually kind of trying to become this good force, supposedly. And Tony is really a representation of the kind of evil things, which is really complicated because Ralph is the person who's always been associated with the devil.
Right.
In fact, the way they get into that scene is incredible. That comes from Tony looking at the light, thinking about it, cutting to the goat, who we saw go into the last shot of the episode Pyomai, episode 5 in this season. Kind of that
trilogy,
The goat Baz, and then we cut to Ralph. So as if we didn't need enough, because this entire show, every time that we've seen Ralph, there's the New Jersey Devil sign, there's Janice reading, you know, about Satan, there's all these things that are linking Ralph to the devil. Now we have a goat, the most classic symbol of Lucifer. Cut to Ralph, but interestingly it's all kind of muddled now with Ralph all in white, Tony in black. The themes that are being suggested in this episode in particular of Tony and Ralph, who is the bad person.
Yeah.
And at the end of this episode, we have to kind of come away and be like, holy shit, like Tony's actually kind of the fucked up guy.
Yeah.
So, really interesting. Eggs, bad things are about to happen.
Also, friendship sour cream.
Friendship sour cream, I know. That's the sour cream we get.
I know, but like, Tony and Ralphie have history.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
I know.
That's the thing that's really like...
Or maybe they just went to Seatown. Maybe the prop department just went to Seatown like us.
I don't know. It was pretty... You could really read the label friendship sour cream. I have to imagine.
I like to think about...
You have many choices in sour cream. You could get the dairy land one.
Sometimes we get Food Town sour cream.
Food Town brand.
Yeah, Food Town brands.
They chose that friendship one. I have faith in them.
Yeah.
Now I can cross friendship sour cream out.
We're giving a lot of like geographical information about us and probably a lot of information about our socioeconomic status at the moment with our sour cream choices.
No, friendship is a good one.
Friendship, I like it. It's good. Anyway, I like though that like
we're not rich.
I like that like subtle relationship though between the scene with Tony right before this in his home of the orange juice, but also like the eggs on bread.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just like it's not a lot, but it's
really nice.
It's kind of cool.
I like when Tony enters that scene at Ralphie's house.
Yeah.
And you can hear him breathing.
Yeah.
And he's talking. You kind of feel like you might be from Tony's perspective just because you can hear his breath.
Yeah.
And he's really playing it cool, right? He's like trying to suss out if Ralphie did it. Like he's gathering evidence at that point, right?
Yeah.
He's like gauging Ralphie's reaction to gather this evidence he needs to do what he needs to do, I guess.
Yeah.
But it is really weird when we see, because we're kind of looking down on Ralphie, and Tony's obviously a lot bigger than Ralphie.
Yeah.
And we just hear this like breath, and we can just feel the tension that's building up in Tony. Like the breath gets kind of quicker.
Yeah.
We don't get a lot of scenes that are like that.
Yeah.
So I liked it.
Yeah, totally. There was something interesting about the contrast of Ralph in the hospital with his son versus Junior in the hospital with his dementia. There were some edits that were kind of playing those off of each other that I thought was interesting in terms of the sincerity, perhaps, of Ralph in that medical kind of situation and the manipulation of Junior and the people around him trying to like manipulate a medical situation for their personal advantage.
Yeah.
There was definitely some kind of back and forth between people in hospitals. And then, and just focusing on them in different ways because they meant such different things to people. Junior saying, like, I love it here. This is way better.
Right. He's like eating Jell-O.
Yeah. And, and I think Ralph, it's very complicated. Like him talking about, like when he's crying, like, I'm a different man. You really do have to question if he could be going in a different direction if Tony didn't murder him for potentially burning down a stable.
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? Like you have to kind of question all the possibilities and then the trajectory that those possibilities take you down, right? Like if we go, like Tony went with a feeling, a belief about the evidence, right? That took him down this path. There was another path, which was like believing that Ralphie wouldn't do that and that it was an electrical fire.
But everybody's so confident in their assertions,
sure,
and that's what's interesting.
Are.
The other example I thought of people being confident is actually Ralph himself at the beginning of the episode, where he says, "Oh fuck, it was Paulie Jr.
Yeah.
He told Paulie, he made the call, and then he's clearly not learned any lessons."
I joked about Shamu's ass.
So clearly, at that point in the episode, he hasn't learned any of his lessons because he's still calling Ginny Sack Shamu.
Rude.
Gotta learn your lesson, man.
That's rude.
That really fucks shit up for you.
I feel like there's something in this episode as well, and I don't know if I've paid attention to it before, but there's something about eyes in this episode. So there's a
really heavy-handed edit.
Yeah. Well, there's that really heavy-handed one, but from the eye of Pyomai to the eye of Junior.
Yeah.
But then, of course, we have Tony kind of getting blinded by the radio, right? And so I don't know. Like again, I wish I could come up with what symbology means on the spot. But something like, I was thinking about like the between Pyomai and Junior, like what's the connection there? And I was kind of thinking about this like, childlike kind of brain, I guess, right? Like this like kind of more simple, at least as far as we know, animal brain, and then Junior in this kind of decreased state and almost like childlike state. And we see that like he has to be taken home by his nurse because
they're both kind of helpless characters at this point. They're kind of being pulled along by other people. They're not they don't have as much agency as
No, and like when we see like Pyomai getting dragged away, that also highlighted that. Like we see Junior getting pulled back to the house. I don't know, there is this kind of aspect of other people being in control. And But there's something more with the eyes. I can't, and like Tony's eyes being really in pain and blinking and the Visine and there's something there. I just can't really put my finger on it.
Well, perhaps, like being blinded to the different sides of a story too. I mean, Ralph is putting out a story and Tony is just...
You can only see one side.
Yeah, he's actually completely confidently sticking to his assertions about what it is, even though that there's the possibility for multiple answers.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day with this episode and probably the show on the whole is that what we're left with is strictly uncertainty. That is all we have. Mm-hmm. And to try and figure out the answer of what Ralph did is impossible. Mm-hmm. We will never know. They don't give you enough information, and I think that uncertainty is the point.
Yeah.
The point is not to figure it out. And the human need is to try and figure it out.
Yeah.
And I think all these characters are struggling with that, and I think all of these characters are trying to come up with an answer to help them cope.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the central theme of this show is that there are no answers, and uncertainty rules over everything.
Yeah. And I think that kind of links in with the water too in some ways, like, because water is, supposed to bring clarity and, like wash away other things. Mm-hmm. And so there's something for me about like when Christopher's in the shower, for example, or Tony's in the shower, like it's like kind of like a coming to terms with, or like kind of like, I guess like feeling absolved of what they've just done.
It's interesting because Ralphie in the bath, Vin Makazian in the shower before they die, for me that is this kind of,
absolution kind of thing.
Ablution or whatever, yeah. But like, for me, there's something more literal about, for Christopher and Tony, I feel like they're just like literally wiping away the blood and bathing themselves to like get rid of the evidence.
Well, sure, but like, isn't that like, so it depends on what you believe, right? Do you believe that you can be absolved of bad things that you've done, or do you believe that you can't? That's also a point of view.
Not by taking a shower.
Not by taking a shower, but like when you talk about Ralphie, right? Like coming around, or like, a new path for Ralphie.
No, it's a great question.
I think it really, it still comes down to what you believe. So you can either believe that a shower is just washing away the evidence, right? Or you can believe that it's cleansing or purifying you of what you've done. It's all in your mindset. It's all in how you see it.
Yeah. Of course. And
these characters can justify anything to themselves, right? So like Tony can justify, like he says, he's like, that guy was an asshole or whatever. Like, I think he said
the guy was a piece
words.
Of shit.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good reason.
That guy was an asshole.
Yeah.
I'm a great actor too, just like James Gandolfini. But yeah, so I don't know, there's something like, anyways, I can't quite put my finger on it, but there is something about the story. Like, Tony can convince himself that he did the right thing. There's nothing in Tony that's gonna be kind of like left wondering about that. Mm-hmm. Christopher, I don't know, like I
think it's complicated for him.
For a few reasons it is the right thing to do. He's Tony's like second in command-ish guy now these days. Yeah. And he was kind of caught being high. Well, he was caught being high, and so it was like, to kind of not have that be used against him. I'm not sure, but anyways, something. I'm going to spin that one around in my head a little bit more. The other thing that kind of, and they use this in this series all the time, well, not all the time, they use this in the series when they want to use it in the series, is giving us this kind of strange passage of time that we have in this episode. So for example, like that scene that we've talked about a couple times now, where we have the scene with Tony and Carmela and AJ in the kitchen and this weird nuzzling that's going on, and then it cuts to Tony in his chair in the back room at the Bing, right? Like how far apart was that? When all of a sudden then we like join Tony in this hotel room with Valentina, like when is that happening? What was he doing before that or after that? Like, well, we know what he was doing after that, but we don't know where he came from in that. And so we have this very strange passage of time. We don't know, like we never besides, but we get these little peeks, right? We have like Tony peeking outside, seeing if it's dark. We have them in the dark when they're throwing the body off the cliff, and when they're burying the head and the hands in Mikey Palmise's dad's house or whatever. and Tony's really good at driving a tractor all of a sudden.
Who knew?
Which again is she's really good at it. But it's hard for us to track, right? So like once they get back to the Bing, the time kind of flows in this weird way. They take showers. Tony falls asleep. He wakes up.
The edits are strange. They're
yeah. So for me, that just kind of like, again, emphasizes that feeling for us as viewers that like we just don't know what's going on and we don't see everything.
Yeah.
And we see some things that the characters don't see. And then, and so it's just an interesting position that it puts us in as viewers to be to have to engage in this same kind of thinking that the characters are engaged in terms of like, who do we believe and what's the truth?
Yeah, totally. There were some clocks too that were showing up in this episode. I wasn't taking note, but they were definitely like consciously showing the time at certain points as well. What else do you think? What else do you have?
I just had like a little thing with Chris chopping up Ralphie's body.
Cleaver.
He's using a cleaver.
Mm-hmm.
So
foreshadowing for those of you who haven't seen it.
Yeah,
Cleaver
I don't know.
Will be a thing later on.
I was also like thinking, has Chris done this before?
Emil Kohler, right? Right at the very beginning.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. With a cleaver though, like that? I thought they used like an electrical saw.
Right. Well, then there's the scene. I think that's later on where they're like in Satrial's and saying, "I'm not going to order a sandwich at Satrial's for a long time."
Right. Yeah.
Nor would
I also like when, what's her name? Svetlana?
Mm-hmm.
When she says that Janice is a very boring woman.
and then Janice starts to cry.
Yeah, makes Janice cry.
As if anybody would care.
Yeah, nobody cares.
Nobody cares. I just had some very small things. Like, yeah, again, just like some of the very beginning shots of kind of like the comedic. There's almost like a slapstick element or something to the way Corrado falls down the stairs.
Yeah.
The way the reporter then
and
said.
That scene is funny, yeah.
And everybody's saying, was he shot? Is he shot in the head? And then she's saying, Corrado Soprano just fell down 7 stairs. Like, it's deliberately kind of humorous.
Yeah.
And then where we end up in the episode, like I was saying earlier, is so the opposite of that. So it's kind of like a bait and switch, considering that like nobody would expect that Ralphie was going to die.
What do you think the turning point in this episode is? Like, where does that turn?
I think it's when Tony kills Ralphie. It happens like kind of out of nowhere.
I feel like it happens kind of before that.
Interesting.
I don't know. I would have to go back and like actually watch for that.
Well, then I guess when Tony gets the call about Pyomon.
I think it is that call.
Yeah. Like, things do change at that moment.
Anyways, I can't quite figure it out, but yeah.
We also have this focus on the goat at multiple points is kind of like foreshadowing of things with Ralphie. I mean, I think we talked about that at the end of episode 5 in this season, the relationship of the goat to Ralphie and how it kind of signifies the conflict that's coming between Tony and Ralphie. And now looking at it, there's actually like Tony Tony is referencing the goat to Carmela when Carmela comes.
Yeah.
And she's at the stable and he's saying like, oh, that's his friend, which is like a strange thing. But there is this like weird interconnectedness of the animals and the characters and Ralphie to having this almost like kind of spirit totem of some sort.
So like, who is Pyomai then? Or what is Pyomai?
I don't know if it is that simple with that. I think, listen to our last episode for us to talk about animals and this concept of Tony's relationship with animals and what that means and how that relates to his psychology and his actions. I think that is something in this season that has been a kind of major point.
Yep. No, for sure.
There was an interesting piece of art too in the hospital, like when Ralph is fighting with his ex-wife, and there's these kind of the art that you see is I thought of note because I mean I wouldn't expect to see art like this in a hospital, so it was clearly deliberate.
Yeah.
But it's kind of these like it's like almost like Matisse, like these kind of like swaths of color that are kind of abstract but kind of are used somewhat structurally in the painting. But there's all these kind of like hot emotions that are running of people coming from different places at that moment over Justin and the use of the bow, and people are kind of, I don't know, at each other's throats, but having different perspectives on everything. And for me, it just kind of made me think of the different perspectives that the characters have in these complicated situations.
Right.
In often not complementary ways or in ways that don't blend. Like they're
totally.
different.
That they're
different concepts.
Like completely opposed.
That was just something small that I thought about.
Yeah.
I mean, other than that, this is one of those episodes, and we've said this in previous ones too. Everything that happens is just completely overshadowed by what happens to Ralph.
And Pyomai.
And Pyomai. Yeah, depending on who you talk to horse lovers, this is all about Pyomai. But it's an amazing episode, and for me, the most memorable of season 4 to this point.
Definitely.
And I think, one of the standout episodes of season 4.
Definitely. I think again, they're also playing with their form here because, you know, you'd expect maybe that some kind of big conflict with Ralphie would come at the end of the season.
Right.
But we get it a little early here.
Yeah. I mean,
I think that's why I also kind of forgot that this all happens in the same episode.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Anyways.
Well, thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks.
We appreciate it.
We do.
And we'll be back soon with episode 10. And we're getting near the end of season 4.
I know. Crazy.
Crazy.
All right. Bye.
See you next time.